Hello there and welcome to Tales of Paranormal London, where we'll be telling our favourite ghost stories and weird stories of London. My name's Rebecca. I've been a tour guide since 2006 and I heard most of my favourite London ghost stories for the first time from the gentleman on my left. This is Gordon.
Hello. I've been a tour guide for a few years as well.
Yeah, longer than me. Yeah. So we're going to be heading out into the City of London, virtually, of course. The City of London is, my hand-drawn map here is not to scale, by the way. It's a square mile, and it was originally founded by the Romans 2,000 years ago. So it's plenty of time to gather all the best ghost stories in the City of London over 2,000 years. Londoners do like a good ghost story, and we're going to see many of them. We're starting down here, right by the river. There's the River Thames there, by Blackfriars Bridge. The River Thames, most bodies of water do have some kind of monster associated with them. The Thames certainly has a superstition. It's still considered good luck to throw a coin or something valuable into the Thames before going on a journey. But not too many river monster stories really associated with the Thames. The Loch Ness has cornered the market on that a few hundred miles north. But there was a monster story. In the 1740s, a creature that was 4 or 5 feet long attacked a child who was mudlarking on the banks of the Thames. The creature was wrestled and out of the water and actually displayed in a London pub, a nearby London pub. This isn't the creature, by the way, this is a similar creature discovered in Portugal around the same time. So the creature was displayed in this pub in the 1740s, and it was described as being like nothing anybody had ever seen. It had over 600 teeth, it had 4 horns on its head, had a face, a hideous face and hands. Creatures that match that description are actually pulled out of the sea today in recent years. They don't look like, when they're pulled out of the sea, they don't look like anything anybody recognises. But spoil sport ecologists say they're probably oarfish, who can get to be quite big and can look very weird when they're out of the water. Not many modern day monsters, although, having said that, in 2016, somebody filmed a dark shape in the Thames, a long dark shape in the Thames on their mobile phone. I couldn't get that footage for this tour, so here's the 19th century equivalent of a similar sea monster in Brazil. Sketching it is about the best you could do in the 19th century. This big long shape was filmed in 2016. A lot of people said it was a fake. Some people facetiously said it was the Loch Ness Monster on holiday. And of course, some people said it was a genuine cryptid, genuine monster. And ecologists were quick to point out that it could just be a big creature. The River Thames used to be very polluted. It was described as monster soup in the 19th century because it was so badly polluted that nothing lived in it, including monsters. And due to efforts to clean it up, it is now healthy. It's healthy enough that whales and dolphins and porpoise and seals can swim up the Thames and not die. So sea monsters could swim up it and not die as well. So maybe the reason the Thames has never really had a proper monster is because it's been so polluted. So watch this space in a few years' time. Now we're moving away from the river, not very far away from the river though, to this lovely pub. This is the Blackfriars Pub. It's a very weird shape. It's just a land ownership thing. It's not worth getting into. Long story. The Blackfriars was built on the site of a monastery called Blackfriars. Is where it gets the name from. The Blackfriars Monastery, very little of it survives. A little bit that does is kind of up the road behind the pub. That little wall. Aren't you glad this is a virtual tour? Because if this was real life, I'd have walked you 10 minutes up the road to look at that uninspiring bit of wall and then 10 minutes back the other way to the pub. So it's built on the site of a monastery that was there for several hundred years until the 1500s when the monks were kicked out. The pub is 19th century. It's a 19th century pub, but in the early 20th century, 1905, very early, it was decorated with images of monks. It's glorious. The inside is amazing if you're ever in London. It's decorated with monks going around their monkly business and farming, and, well, perhaps having a bit too much of a good time, eating too much pie, having too much merriment. And since 1905, the ghost of a monk was seen in the pub. Apparently, maybe he didn't like these images that were done. A ghost of a monk was seen and heard making sounds in the cellar. In the 1980s, the statue was put up above the door, and the ghost hasn't been seen since. That's the legend anyway. Having said that, I was in there a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, and I asked one of the barmen, is there really a ghost here? And he said, well, you know, I do hear weird things in the cellar after the pub has closed for the night. So maybe the ghost is just making itself heard but not seen lately. Now, carrying on but staying in the same kind of area. So the Blackfriars Pub is to our right. We're on New Bridge Street here. Below New Bridge Street is actually a river, a lost river. The River Fleet used to flow along this road ahead of us, and now it's below the road because it was used as an open sewer and it stank and we had to cover it. But to the left used to be Bridewell Prison, about where the Tesco is. The Bridewell Prison, this is it depicted in the 17th century, was a women's prison in the 17th century. And over the Fleet, out over the Fleet, was a ducking stool. Now, ducking stools were used as punishment mainly for women's crimes, used as punishment for women who'd been accused of being a scold or a nag or whatever the archaic term is for talking too much. I can't remember it. And it wasn't supposed to be deadly. It was just supposed to be humiliating. But it was also used, of course, for the witch trials, which could be deadly. The witch trials, some did happen in London. I'm pleased to say London suffered a bit less than other parts of the country, but there were certainly witch trials in London. There were fewer witch trials in London, and contemporary authors and since have said, oh, that's because Londoners are too cosmopolitan. You know, there was too much learning in London. Nobody really believed in witches in London, and nobody was going to be taken in by these witch finder generals. I mean, that's not strictly true. Londoners are a superstitious bunch and have been historically. In the Thames are lots of witch bottles, and buried across London and the country. Witch bottles are intended to protect you from a witch or a curse. So they're quite small, though, you know, that big. Size of your hand, if that. They're filled with something of you, so a fingernail or a bit of hair or whatever. Some red thread, something sharp, something valuable are put into it. And then you throw it somewhere where it's never going to be discovered in your lifetime. So in London, the Thames is favourite. So these witch bottles are dragged out of the Thames from all periods of history, up to and including the 1980s. Witch bottles have been pulled out with coins in from the 1980s. So Londoners are a superstitious bunch, even up to this day. And we're going to learn a few superstitions, London superstitions, as we go along. But we're going to go on to Fleet Street. Fleet Street here for St. Bride's Church, one of my favourite churches in London. This is St. Bride's with the tiered spire. St. Bride's Church is just off Fleet Street. It's ancient foundations. The first church on the site was founded in the 6th century, though the current church is 17th century, the current building. Fabulous museum in the church, by the way. If you're ever in London, down in the crypt is a great museum displaying all the archaeology they've discovered going as far back as the Romans. But St. Bride's, it's difficult to take a photo of from Fleet Street because there's buildings in the way. There you go, that's a bit better. And St. Bride's has its own legend. St. Bride's has the legend of a coachman who had a pretty horrific night one night. This is one of Gordon's stories.
Well, the popular story goes that there was a coachman heading towards the city one night who was flagged down by a gentleman who asked to be taken to St. Bride's. The horses were startled and the coachman's hat fell off as the gentleman boarded the coach. Without looking, his fare told him that the hat was underneath the horse's feet. The horses continued to startle all the way to St. Bride's. As the coachman leaned back to get his money when they arrived, the man turned into a bear with flaming eyes. The coachman lashed at him with a horsewhip, and the creature disappeared in a flash of flame, and the horses bolted home. The gentleman was paralyzed for the rest of his life. So says the ballad printed in the 17th century.
Yes. For some context, ballads and sort of penny dreadfuls is the same kind of source that we get Sweeney Todd from. And some do say that there's while it's what's the word, sensationalized, dramatized, there may be some truth to the story of Sweeney Todd. So maybe there is some truth to the story of that poor coachman and his terrifying night at St. Bride's. Now let's keep going. Oh, there's a coachman. Sorry, I forgot to put that up when you were telling your story.
Oh, that's okay. Don't forget, the River Fleet, like many of the rivers in London, is culverted over now. And there's a whole tradition that says that rivers which are covered over become like magnets for spirits and disembodied entities. So this is the sort of groundwork you look on. And when you're going down the Street of Ink, as it was known because of newspapers, but the River Fleet is beneath the road that we're traveling on.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's right. Yeah. So going up a street called Old Bailey, there it is. Old Bailey, looking very modern there. The street is actually called Old Bailey, but the building that most people refer to as Old Bailey is this building here. That's the Central Criminal Court, our highest criminal court in the UK, apart from the Supreme Court. The Old Bailey is built on the site of Newgate Prison. Newgate Prison was around from the 13th century, I think, to the 19th century. A notoriously dreadful prison, Newgate. And we have, well, I say we, Gordon has two stories from Newgate Prison, one from the 13th century, one from the 19th century. I'll stick a couple of gloomy pictures of Newgate up for you there.
There's some glue. In the 13th century, a chap was imprisoned at Newgate Prison. He was accused of being a sorcerer. At this time, England was suffering through a famine. And during the famine, of course, the prisoners of Newgate were not high on the list of people to be fed. So as a result of this, prisoners were subject to starvation and resorted to cannibalism. The sorcerer himself was killed and eaten. Now, a few days later, a large black dog with flaming red eyes appeared in the corridors of the prison, stalking through and apparently hunting down each one of the chaps who'd killed his master. Some of the murderers were so terrified that they fled the prison, but the black dog followed them. To this day, a black shape is often seen crawling along the top of the wall, which was once the boundary wall of the Newgate prison. A second story comes from the 19th century, so it's a little bit more up to date. Amelia Dyer, a baby farmer who killed many infants, possibly as many as 400. She was found guilty in May 1896 and was hanged at Newgate Prison in June of that year. Mr. Scott was the chief warder at the time, and he accompanied Dyer to the scaffold. He said that just before she went to the hangman, she looked straight at him and said, "I'll meet you again, sir." Just before Newgate Prison was permanently closed, Scott and the other warders were toasting the old prison with a whiskey in the yard. When Scott suddenly remembered Dyer's words for no apparent reason, And when he looked around, he saw her face staring at him through a window in the door. On the day the prison was closed, the warders gathered for a group photograph, and a copy of the photograph was sent to each of them. When Scott received his copy, he said he saw Dyer's face peering over his shoulder.
That's a creepy story. And apparently no one else ever saw her ghost, only him, only Scott. So, oh, freaky. She looks scary too. Now we're going to carry on. Going up towards, just round the corner, actually Amen Corner there, if you're ever in the area. Amen Corner, that's an Ave Maria Lane is where the ghost of the Black Dog is still said to be seen. But we're going up to St. Paul's Cathedral, one of my favourite churches, one of my favourite buildings in the world, I think. St. Paul's Cathedral is once again an ancient site. The first St. Paul's was established on the site in 604 AD, although this building is about 300 years old. And it does have a ghost. It has the ghost of a priest in one of the aisles of the church, which are the bits either side, not the bit down the middle for you pub quiz aficionados. In one of the chapels off one of the aisles is a whistling ghost is seen, a whistling priest. So this priest is seen to be wearing clothes that are like hundreds of years out of date, and he whistles, not happily, not mournfully, just the kind of whistling when you're bustling about doing your business. But this ghost's whistling is said to be so loud that it disturbs worshippers in the church, and they go and complain to the verger, and the vergers have to explain, oh yeah, sorry, that's the ghost, we can't really do much about him. And I'd like to tell you my own ghost story at St. Paul's Cathedral. This happened to me. So I was in St. Paul's one day, not the day this photograph was taken, by the way. This is a special evening when they allowed photography, which they usually don't at St. Paul's. I was in there with a group, basically. We'd been doing something all day. We'd got to St. Paul's actually quite late. So I took my group into St. Paul's, told them good parts of the cathedral to see and sort of let them all go off and do whatever they were interested in. So they all went sort of scuttling off. None of the group stayed with me, which I didn't mind because I wanted to go off on my own as well. So I went off exploring the church, catching up with members of my group, and oh yes, we'll meet you outside. Okay. I was the last one of my group, certainly. And I thought, look, before I go, I just want to have a quick walk through the crypt I can't remember, I had something that I wanted to go and see. So I went into the crypt. As I was walking past, this is the Duke of Wellington, who won the Battle of Waterloo. As I was walking past his tomb, and it was dead quiet, there was nobody here, not like this photo. I felt sharp taps on my shoulder. I looked around, actually assuming it was one of my group that I must have missed in the cathedral, and there was just nobody there. I must have been one of the last people in the church. There was nobody in the crypt at all. I'm normally quite level-headed, actually, or I think I am, but I went through the rest of the crypt quite quickly. After that, I did say to the verger, I know that a lot of London venues and tube stations, pubs and things, they keep a ghost log for anything weird that's happened. So I told one of the vergers what had happened, and she said, oh yeah, we get that a lot, which is a bit deflating, really. If she'd laughed at me or said, oh, that's really scary, I think I'd have felt better. But no, apparently there's a poking ghost who frequently pokes people in the crypt, which I can personally attest to. Where are we next? Where are we going next? Ah, yes, this is your spooky tube story.
The spooky tube?
Yes, so we're going to St. Paul's Tube Station, which is right behind St. Paul's Cathedral. There it is. The London Underground has got a lot of ghosts, and for some reason I find tube ghosts really creepy, so Gordon's going to do this one.
It's again St. Paul's. We have a commuter. He was travelling into St. Paul's Tube Station, and he noticed a girl sitting opposite him on the train. And she had long black hair that almost completely covered her face and was looking down into her lap. She was sitting motionless. He felt a little bit unsettled, but he couldn't explain why, and went home. The next day, though, he happened on the tube again to St. Paul's, and there she was, sitting motionless, her head bowed, her hair concealing her features. By the fourth time, she was there again, but as he got up to get off at St. Paul's, he looked back to see that she was staring straight at him. Her face was pale and ashen, and her eyes were dark. The commuter rushed off the train. He never saw the young woman again, but remained convinced that she was not of this world.
Oh, tube stories are creepy. The tube is creepy. I would be creeped out just in a carriage on my own like that. Right, just behind, so if we were standing outside St. Paul's tube station, if you turned around, you'd see that, Christchurch, Greyfriars, one of my favourite churches. I do realise I've said that about every single one of them. This is because they're all good. So Christchurch, Greyfriars, as you can see, not a complete church any longer. Poor old church was fairly unlucky. It was destroyed during the Great Fire of London in 1666 and then rebuilt. And was again destroyed during World War II in the 1940s and not rebuilt. Instead, it was made into this beautiful garden, lovely place, very peaceful. And it's haunted by two ghosts who can see each other, which I've always wondered about. I've always wondered whether ghosts can see other ghosts. So one ghost is from the 14th century, 1300s, and one is from the 1500s. So we'll start with the 14th century ghost. That's Queen Isabella. She was the wife of Edward II. In fact, she arranged his murder with her boyfriend, Roger Mortimer. She was buried in this church in Christchurch, Greyfriars, and haunted it. About 200 years later, another woman was buried at the church. I don't have a photo of her, sadly, Agnes Hungerford, Lady Agnes Hungerford, who was also found guilty of murdering her husband. She was buried in the church as well. And again, her ghost was seen to walk in the church. And in the 19th century, the two ghosts became aware of each other for some reason. And when they did become aware of each other, they started to fight. There was this spectral fight used to take place in the church between these two women, between Isabella and Agnes, that was said to be so awful, so dreadful, that a night watchman fled the church after seeing it and never came back, not even for his wages. He never set foot in the church again. The ghosts, what they're fighting about, nobody really knows. Nobody's thought to ask them because it's scary. No one's going to stop. The church also used to be haunted by the ghost of a greyhound that used to run around the church. Oddly, not been seen at all since the damage was done during the Second World War. The ghostly fight has been seen since then. Now, carrying on up to Threadneedle Street. Threadneedle Street for the Bank of England. There it is. The Bank of England nicknamed the Old Lady of Threadneedle Street, although I've never actually heard a real Londoner call it that outside of tour guides. The Bank of England, there is, I think the first real proper ghost story, London ghost story I heard is this one, and I heard it from Gordon. So Gordon can tell it. Before you do though, I'll put up a picture of the Bank of England, how it looked at the time of the ghost story. There we go.
The Bank of England, oddly enough, known as the Old Lady of Threadneedle Street, the old lady might refer to Sarah Whitehead, who was a sister of a clerk at the Bank of England. He was charged with forgery in 1811. He was found guilty at the Old Bailey and he was hanged. His sister, as I said, Sarah Whitehead, was badly affected by the accusations, the slanders on her brother as she felt they were, and throughout the trial and even after her brother's execution, she visited the Bank of England dressed in black, asking after her brother. Obviously, the terrible trauma had affected her mind. She died in 1837 and was said to be buried in the graveyard of St. Christopher le Stocks, which is now part of the Bank of England. But even after her death, she has been seen in the streets around the Bank of England and even on the platforms of the bank station of the Underground. She's even been known to appear so real that people think she's living when she asks them, "Have you seen my brother?" before she dissolves before their eyes.
That's creepy. There's another ghost at the Bank of England. I can't remember whether I heard this from you or not, but there's another ghost at the Bank of England. A very, very tall figure is seen actually in the Bank of England itself, not really in the streets. Sarah's seen all over the area, but the bank nun, as she's known, is seen all over the area. But there was a very tall, in the very late 1700s, there was a very tall employee at the Bank of England, 7 feet tall, which is pretty tall now, but in the late 1700s, that's really tall. And he was really worried that his body, when he died, would be a target for grave robbers, which were a thing in the late 1700s. So he worked for the Bank of England at the time. So this is the garden at the Bank of England, which was part of the church yard, part of the churchyard next door, St. Christopher le Stocks, where Sarah Whitehead was buried. He asked if he could be buried in the grounds of the Bank of England, inside this little courtyard garden, inside the Bank of England, which is still there. The bank agreed and said yes, they would. So when he died, he was buried in the middle of the night because they didn't want to disturb banking hours in this little garden, which was no longer a churchyard. It's said that his ghost walks because he was not buried on consecrated ground or buried on ground that was no longer a churchyard, and that he didn't have a proper funeral because it was the middle of the night. The very tall ghost, I don't know, I don't know how recently the last time the very tall ghost was seen, but the bank nun sightings are reasonably frequent. Right, off we go, down onto King William Street for one of my favourite topics, which is ghost stations. This is King William Street in the City of London. Ghost stations isn't anything spooky about it particularly. It just means a disused London Underground station. There's actually quite a few of them around London, and there's one of them underneath King William Street, although the surface building doesn't survive. The platform underneath does. There we go. So this is the blue plaque for King William Street, and that's one of the trains that would have gone through it, although that's not actually a platform at King William Street. So King William Street, as you can see, didn't last very long. It opened in 1890 and closed in 1900. And half of the station was just sealed off and has never been reopened since, for reasons best known to the London Underground. Half of it was reopened as an air raid shelter during World War II, and then archive storage for the officers above. But the other half has never been opened since 1900. This is not King William Street because it's not been opened. That's the whole point of the story. This is other disused railway stations. This is Brompton Road and Aldwych. It's said really soon after the station was sealed up in 1900, it was said that some Londoners were living on the platforms at King William Street Station and were so isolated from the rest of London. There was this troglodyte population in London. That rumour keeps coming up and down every now and again. Last time I heard the story, it was that they had mutated, but that may have been someone who'd been watching too much Futurama. But there is a persistent theory about this troglodyte population, and they're based around King William Street Underground Station. It's apparently a spooky place, the bit that's open. People who've been down there to store archives say that you can see indistinct figures, indistinct shadowy figures moving in amongst the boxes of storage. I just creeped myself out. Let's keep going. Onto the London Stone, another one of my obsessions. I do have several. I go in and out of little obsessions. So the London Stone, this is Cannon Street in the City of London, not far, just around the corner from King William Street. And the London Stone is just down, that chap is just about to walk past it. There we go. The London Stone has been a part of London's history since the 1180s, for 900 years. It's mentioned every now and again. It's mentioned by Shakespeare. It's mentioned throughout London's history in the time in between, but we don't know what it is. It's a bit of stone and we don't know where it's from. I've heard a lot of theories. I've heard a theory that it's just a bit of medieval masonry. It's a part of the first stone London Bridge, which was being built in the 1180s. I've heard a theory that it's a Roman mile marker. It's the remains of a Roman mile marker like this one in Anglesey. Or that it's part of a stone circle. We don't know that there was any kind of stone circle or standing stone or anything like that in London before the Romans got here, but there may have been. And the idea is that the London stone is the remains and that it has magical properties because of this ancient history. Those magical properties stories only were helped by the fact that during World War II, here's the London stone in behind that grill. It was set in the wall of a church, which was destroyed by a bomb during World War II. As you can see, the only part of the church that survived was the bit with the London stone in it. There's an old legend. So as well as it being a magical stone, there's an old legend that says if the London stone ever leaves the square mile city of London, something horrible will happen. And so it's never left the city of London. But we're modern Londoners, right? We don't believe in silly things like that. Well, maybe we do. In 2016, the London stone had to be moved because the building that it was set into was being rebuilt. So the London stone was moved. It could have gone anywhere. There's museums all over this country with excellent facilities for trying to figure out what the stone is. It went to the Museum of London, which coincidentally is inside the square mile city of London. It never left. Who have excellent facilities as well, of course. And they did examine it. They found out that it's limestone that's native to this country. So the stone wasn't imported, which I think is what they were hoping, because then they would have been able to tell what it was. So we don't know anything more about London stone, but London stone still hasn't left the square mile city of London, because we're not superstitious, you know, in London. We're modern people, but let's not try it. There's no use tempting fate. Now let's keep going. Going down to St. Magnus the Martyr, down at the end of Pudding Lane. St. Magnus the Martyr, there it is, one of my favourite churches in London. You'll be unsurprised to hear. St. Magnus the Martyr was the first church to be destroyed by the Great Fire of London in 1666, and it sat beside London Bridge for centuries. This is modern London Bridge here. It's said to be the most haunted church in London. Its celebrity ghost is Miles Coverdale, who first translated the Bible into English and survived, unlike Tyndale. He's seen lurking in the sides of the church. He was a rector here when he was alive. There is another ghost story, though, attached to the church, which I think is a lovely ghost story. And this is one of yours, isn't it?
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay. I was waiting for Miles Coverdale. What happened to him?
I've done Miles Coverdale. There he is on the
He
screen.
wasn't executed, though, was he?
No, he wasn't executed.
His ghost. Anyway, listen. The allegedly Magnus the Martyr is haunted by the ghost of Thomas Fariner, who was also buried there. Fariner owned the bakery, infamous as where the Great Fire of London started in 1666. It was an accident, but Fariner himself denied any involvement whatsoever, something that has rankled him even in his post-mortem stage as a ghost. His ghost has been seen walking in St. Magnus the Martyr until 1986. Now, in 1986, the Worshipful Company of Bakers finally took responsibility for the Great Fire of London and apologized on Fariner's behalf. His ghost hasn't been seen since.
I like that. Ghost laid to rest. That's nice.
Yes.
Dear old Fariner.
Yes.
Right, off we go. Pudding Lane is right opposite the church, by the way, which is why he was buried there. Now, going just up the road there to All Hallows by the Tower. Oh, look, it's my favourite church in London. All Hallows by the Towers, once again, ancient foundations. I keep saying that, but most churches in the City of London have quite ancient foundations. All Hallows by the Tower is another one that's slightly unfortunate. It was partially damaged during the Great Fire of London and partially rebuilt, and then partially damaged again during the Blitz in the 1940s, and the bit that was destroyed was rebuilt. So it's a weird kind of mishmash of different ages, this church. And it was historically haunted by a cat. So there was a ghost cat at All Hallows by the Tower. There's the interior of the church, looking jolly nice. The cat was seen, or sort of anyway, sort of a cat, I mean. In the 1930s, a group were inside the church here practicing Christmas carols for the Christmas concerts, Christmas services rather. They were here practicing the carols, and the whole group saw a woman sitting in one of the pews who looked a bit strange. And as they watched her, she disappeared and the ghost cat appeared in her place. And then the ghost cat disappeared as well. This really weird story of this really weird ghost, this cat woman sort of creature, hasn't been seen since the damage during the Second World War. And actually, when we were researching this, when we were sort of practicing for this tour, I've come up with this theory, because there's the greyhound at Christchurch Greyfriars, which hasn't been seen since the Second World War, and the cat that hasn't been seen since the Second World War. There was a tradition, not done now, but if you're an animal lover, by the way, you might want to cover your ears for this. It's not done anymore, not since the 18th century, but it used to be a medieval tradition up until the 18th century that a creature was buried, walled up within the walls of a building to bring it good luck, including churches. So that could be a cat or a chicken or a small dog. So I wonder if the ghost cat and the ghost dog, the parts of the church that were destroyed during the World War II were the parts that were holding their soul in place. Maybe that's where their bodies were. I don't know. I'm not an expert on ghosts, but it seems like a nice sort of thing. I hope their spirits are free anyway, whatever's happened. Now, theoretically, I said at the beginning this tour was going to be in the City of London, so we should stop right now. Because the City of London boundaries, that black car just there is about to go over the City of London boundaries. But just beyond the City of London is the Tower of London, London's castle. And we can't do a tour about ghosts and not take a few steps over to the Tower of London. So there it is. Oops, no, it's not. That's All Hallows, sorry. The Tower of London, there we go. The Tower of London there, it's London's only castle. The first bit, which in the middle there with the flag, was built by William the Conqueror in the 11th century. And it's where all the ghastly stuff has happened. So inside the Tower of London, there's been murders and executions and torture and zoos and imprisonment and sieges and accidents and just every horrible thing you can imagine has taken place at the Tower of London. So it's no wonder it's got ghosts. The Tower of London is just incredibly haunted. The Tower of London has so many ghosts. It's got celebrity ghosts at the tower. They've got the ghosts of Sir Walter Raleigh and the ghost of a bear, the ghost of the princes in the bloody tower. Guy Fawkes' screams are heard in the dark corridors of the tower. Ghostly footsteps are heard. The ghost of Guildford Dudley is seen in the Beauchamp Tower where this graffiti is. This is perhaps his graffiti. His wife's name, Jane, Lady Jane Grey, whose ghost is also seen at the Tower of London. In the Armoury, where the Armoury is kept on display in the White Tower, people feel a feeling of being suffocated, being threatened, sort of a claustrophobic feeling in quite a big room. I personally find these horse mannequins very creepy, but that might just be me. In the same building as the Armoury, the White Tower, there's a 900-year-old chapel, beautiful thing, St. John's, where people smell a strong floral smell that's so strong, it's like sickening, it's cloying almost. It's just, there's ghosts everywhere at the Tower of London. You got any ghosts at the tower?
I was going to say, not offhand, I mean, the ghosts of the floral smell, of course, in the old days, they used to carry a pocket full of posies around to protect from the miasma, which they believed was the plague, the cause of the plague in olden days. So the smell of posies might be expected, but of course, the Tower of London wasn't the most pleasant of places. In days of old, of course, it was where they had a menagerie of animals and prisoners. People were imprisoned and, yes, executed, as you see the ones who left their mark on the walls there as well. It's a ghastly old place, full of dark history. it's hardly surprising. You have ghosts, many ghosts, ghostly figures, procession of ghostly figures follow people at Sally Gate. There's been processions of monks seen heading out from the tower, possibly around Tower Green. There's a procession on Tower Green to St. Peter ad Vincula, which people believe was connected with Anne Boleyn and her execution. There's a headless cloaked figure which was seen frightening a guard into insensibility once at the Tower of London. Headless figures wouldn't be terribly pleasant for anyone, I don't think. Thomas Tower collapsed twice in the 1240s, both times on St. George's Day. Henry III said the ghost of Thomas Becket had been seen on those days. The king renamed the tower after Thomas, and the tower hasn't fallen since. And Becket's ghost hasn't been seen since either, although a ghostly monk appears in Thomas's tower. So again, we've got what appear to be the spirits of monks processing, probably feeling, times of persecution, of course. In days of old, it was quite a frequent occurrence. The Raven Master of the Tower of London, Chris Scaife, once told the story of putting the ravens into their nighttime enclosures, and the birds wouldn't come past a girl who was sitting on the bench. And Scaife didn't recognize her as one of the other residents' children, and there were no visitors at the tower at that time of night. He asked the girl politely if she wouldn't mind watching the birds from another place so that he could get the ravens to bed. He turned to undo the enclosure, and he turned back to shoo the birds, and the child had disappeared. He searched around for her. He was worried that he'd scared her off or upset her, but she was nowhere to be found. Another story from a guard who was patrolling near the Bloody Tower in the middle of the night, when he sat down on a bench with his back to the wall to remove a stone in his shoe. As he removed the stone, a voice next to his ear whispered, "There's only you and me here." He jumped up and said, "Give me a second to put this shoe back on, and there'll only be you here." He hurriedly put his shoe back on and continued with his patrol. He never sat in that part of the tower again.
That is a very Londoner response to a ghost.
Yeah.
Just talk to the ghost. No, I'm going, mate. Sorry.
I'm going. I'm off.
I'm off. Yes, the tower, very creepy place. And that brings us to the end. I think we could probably do about 2 hours on the Tower of London ghosts. Thank you very much. If you've enjoyed this, please do donate to the Multiple Sclerosis Society, a charity that's close to both of our hearts. justgiving.com/fundraising/virtually London. That should read MS Society. I'll put the link in the comments. With thanks to the British Library's Flickr page, which is a great way to waste your life. The paranormaldatabase.com, equally loads of good ghost stories on there. Thank you so much. Our next outing is going to be staying in the City of London, but talking about animals and creatures. Do you have any questions?
No, actually, I don't think so.
I do have a question for you, actually.
What?
You've told me this before, the theory about why the Tower of London is so haunted, the stone memory thing.
Oh, yeah. Well, one theory about places of hauntings, and it particularly goes with older established buildings, is that events are somehow recorded in the fabric of the building, in the actual stones themselves. This is a bit of an outlandish theory, but it's fairly well accepted, that events can be triggered. If someone who is perhaps a little psychically aware, or even if they're unaware, but they are susceptible, they can serve as triggers for events which are recorded within the very stones themselves of the building. And this is quite a common, it's quite a common theory. Well, it should be anyway. I think it's quite a reasonable one, that ghosts don't just wander around. They're actually recordings which are replayed according to the right person at the right moment in time, conditions.
I mean, that does explain why the tower is so creepy. So.
It does explain why the tower is so creepy. And another, I mean, one of my personal things, and again, it goes into explaining the tower, is that ghosts are often seen near bodies of water. And it's said that they draw some kind of energy from flowing water. And of course, the biggest body of water at the Tower of London is the Thames itself.
Right beside it. Yeah.
Right beside it, from which prisoners used to be taken into Traitor's Gate, and the last thing they would see was the inscription, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter." And so going from the river into the tower, you've got a lot of people's last very strong emotions, fear, sheer horrible fear of what was about to happen to them. It's no surprise that these things would be embedded in the stone, waiting to be replayed by the right person. So if you know anyone who's faintly psychic, be very careful going to the Tower of London.
All over London.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good evening. Sleep well.
Yes.